Oh, got it.
I'm recording. I forgot.
From the scenes forward, and then I can kind of pick it up from the room if you want.
Sure. I mean, I think that the idea behind not casting a singular Billy Tipton was really rooted in not knowing, like, there, first of all, there's like no moving footage of Billy. There's photographs, there's letters he's written, you know, we know he existed, there's audio tapes, but there is nothing that shows us how he moves. And I think that it's just a little bit too, that's just one little element of it. But the idea is not having one person play Billy for this role really opened up the conversation to allow us to have this be such a collaboration and have transmasculine artists and actors come in for the role and also have these conversations. Was that the answer to that? Maybe that's the first part of the question answered, right?
I think so, you know, and I think for us too, we were really interested in what a project like this could be about, which is kind of a trick of a statement, right? Because you think, An Ordinary Man, the Billy Tipton documentary, it's about Billy Tipton. But I think you could make an argument that the film is in fact not about Billy Tipton at all. And it's about a kind of media making, legacy making, representational history. And so if you invest in the project from that place, all of a sudden you recognize that a kind of reenactment or a kind of biopic, to your question, is such a flattening method through which to engage these questions. And I think we've all watched the films that try to embody someone from history, and you just see the way that race, class, and gender become collapsed into these like overly determined categories. And so by opening Tipton back up, I think we get to say, you know, what's at stake and for whom when we try to approach history in this way.
Yeah, and also, I mean, one thing that I was in tears when I saw it this morning, before the screening this evening, is Billy Jr.'s response. He's been fed this version of his father, and suddenly, you know, to show him that this man was a hero is, I mean, what was Billy's response to the film?
I think that there's a couple different ways to answer that. You know, the one thing that we recognized when we went to Spokane to spend time with him, and to be clear, we spent the most time with Billy Jr. of anyone else in the film, rightfully so. And it was immediately apparent to us that he, as you said, was a product of the same kind of media narratives about his father that we all were. And so he had internalized so many of the scripts and ways of understanding transness through the tabloid and talk show machine. And so I think he was rightfully a little bit suspicious of who we were and why we wanted to tell the story, because he really does identify as the keeper of his father's legacy, as the protector of his dad, however imperfect we might encounter that, you know? So it's so interesting when you want to say, oh, but he uses such transphobic language, or he doesn't understand anything about queer history. And on the other hand, staunchly stands by his father's life and identity and legacy. And that kind of conflict, that kind of friction is so interesting to me, because it doesn't let us sort of collapse people into good versus bad subjects. And so it was really a kind of ongoing engagement of intimacy building with him over the course of the days. And, you know, we would end shooting and Amos and I would talk as the trans people in the room, and we'd be like, it's so intense to encounter someone speaking in this way, while also recognizing that we're totally aligned in a lot of ways with how we feel about Billy Tipton Sr., with the recognition of the kind of cruelty of the media machine that produced his story. And then I think, you know, as we explore in the film, there came a kind of point of no return where I recognized, as the person who was asking him all of the questions, that I needed to step toward him and out myself to really ground who we were as a team and why we were so invested in spending time in this place with him.
I mean, at what point in the process did you do that? Like, for how long had you spent, how much time had you already spent with him?
That's a really great question. I would say we were probably 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah.
Well over half. And in part because, you know, I think transness is such a slippery thing. I think for people close to it, you see it immediately. You can see it in the grocery store and you're like, boom, hello, even if you don't, right? It's a kind of nod and a recognition. And then it's so easily find yourself passing in ways that are unexpected. I mean, Amos and I identify as like very out, very vocal, very, you know, people who are willing and interested in talking about transness in these ways. And it was kind of another one of those reminders where I was like, oh, right, we're not being clocked at all. Like we are being really framed as outsiders to the experience, much like Billy Tipton Jr. was.
I have another question before I hand it over to Romeo, and it's just more of an observation, but the buck scene, it was just so fantastic to watch. But Amos, how did you feel being someone's buck in a sense? Like, how is that? It must have been so mind-blowing to have that experience.
It was very sweet. I mean, I like have a soft spot for Buck anyway. Like I would love to see, to learn more about him. I wish there was more information about Buck Thomason and what happened to him after the Billy Tipton years. But I mean, it was definitely like, you know, it took me out of the moment and to recognize that I had, you know, the work that I'd done had touched someone before that moment. So that was it was very sweet.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
It was really moving. Ron, do you want to?
You've asked many good questions. No, I was reading in A Queer Time and Place by Jack Harberston recently, but that was in 2005, right? And he asked this question, what would the biography look like if the biographer identified with Billy? And, you know, referring to Middlebrook's biography, I guess, and all that. And it's like, wow, in 2020, I guess, do you see yourselves, you've done it? Because I think this is identification. You had all the sensitivity in making this film, and you know, you're showing it from the perspective of it, from Billy's perspective. Somehow he was not there to tell his own story, and many not so cool people who've done it, and it wasn't, but you've come along and you've done it. So like, how do you relate to that, you know, like?
I love that question. And it's such a great like trans cinema studies geeky question, because that book was like so pivotal. Yeah. It was so pivotal in my like early graduate school education. And like one of the things that's so great about that book, and I think one of the reasons why it holds up, is because one of the things that Jack argues is for something that he calls doubling, which, you know, at its most simplistic is the presence of more than one trans subject in a narrative destabilizes our ability to read transness in one particular way. And he's really talking about the legacy of trans representation, where there's only ever one isolated trans subject who seems to know no one like themselves and live in total isolation, which we understand is a fiction, right? But I think that our film is really thinking about doubling or tripling, or the idea of the cohort as a way to sort of talk back to representational practices that have been historically violent and aggressive toward trans people. And I think Middlebrook's book is a great example of a kind of cultural text that pulls a trans person out of a network and says they're alone and nobody knows. And this is one of Amos's favorite stories. Yes. that I can like hand off to you because it's related. So
yeah, there's this moment in the Middlebrook book where she says that Billy, there is no one like Billy. I'm paraphrasing, but Diane Middlebrook says there's nobody like Billy anywhere in the world, definitely not in Oklahoma City. He's all alone. There's, you know, how can he exist? And then in the next paragraph says, and then Billy comes across a radio DJ named Buck Thomason, who, similar to Billy, dresses like a man, has girlfriends on his arm, has a very deep voice, passes in the world as, like, literally goes against everything she has said for the whole book to this moment, which I think is so interesting. So I love to like focus on those moments where you're doubling, you're bringing in, you're seeing all these other like trans specific people that were in his life, that were like in his scene. Like if you think about like Little Axe, the jazz musician, who maybe they didn't cross paths, but they were existing in the same world and in the same scenes in different coasts. So it's like these moments are very important to highlight, and yeah, love it.
You want to ask a question? We have a really DIY setup, so
that's great.
I love it. It's great.
Hi, I'm Jack, and I've worked as a trans consultant in Italy on 2 sets. And one thing that I was fighting was actually this idea that there's just going to be the one trans person who's alone. And another thing I was fighting was the visibility of trans masculine people, and how in a story set in the 80s in a nightclub, they were convinced that, you know, I was trying to construct this nightclub in a way that we could have some trans masculine people, but also some butch women involved somewhere there, because if I was arguing, if there are trans women and if there are queer women, there very well will be also masculine women and trans masculine folk, and they just couldn't comprehend that. It was too much of a leap to understand that. So seeing your film gave me a lot of energy in the sense of you know, really fully like understanding and comprehending, like obviously, and I know that we've existed throughout history and in different areas. And then one thing in this concept that you were going on about doubling that I've been toying to and fro for the past hour is, on the one hand, I feel many people read Billy Tipton and would perhaps say like, wow, how brave to do that alone, right? And then on the other hand, we just don't know the other trans people that were around him. So it's that kind of, it's actually, you're trying to undermine that narrative of, you know, he was the only one, and doing this in both the way you constructed the story and the way we're talking about it as well now. And now there's a question, but it's no longer my reflection, but this something about how this talks to the need for telling trans, you know, stories that also, or telling our own stories as trans masculine people. And I'm wondering if you've seen a shift, or if you've seen a change in the industry, I don't know, in talking with producers and how they welcome or perceive stories that have trans characters in them, that are trans men, or has your film in any way been also a way in to be able to talk about more trans representation that is authentic also to a trans masculine experience, or not?
I mean, I think it's definitely happening behind the scenes slowly. Like you've seen a small shift here and there. There's like, you know, maybe you'll see like 2 queer trans masculine looking people on a screen, or like within one episode of a show, like in the background. But I think that there's still a long ways to go. And I think that producers and maybe executives in Hollywood are open to these ideas, but that it still takes a lot of work to get there on a larger scale. What do you think?
You know, one of the things that we love too is the opportunity to cast for a documentary about the life and history of Billy Tipton meant that we received an extraordinary number of self-tapes from extraordinary trans masculine talent, all of whom are hustling in the industry. And because they all entered the film knowing explicitly that it was a documentary and that there was no role to receive or to be competitive for, there was an incredible amount of camaraderie in those rooms. And so what you see in those waiting rooms is, you know, what I would argue is the largest group of trans masculine talent in LA or in New York, many of whom are only ever together to compete against each other for the one trans masculine role on the one show in the one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so in some ways, the intervention is to make visible the multiplicity of people and identities and ways in which people can be on screen. And what I loved is that in each of those spaces, in each of those cities, the groups reflected on the kind of ecosystems of Hollywood and performance and sort of film and TV that were present at the time. And if we were to shoot that film now, those conversations would be different, because that's how fast the landscape of representational possibility is changing. And I think Amos and I have particular vantage points from directing and writing and being in rooms and being in development. But I think, being on screen is a really different force, and you're contending with all kinds of decisions that have nothing to do with your talent. And I'll be really curious to watch, but I have a sneaky feeling that some of the people in our film will have some very long lives and careers on screen.
And if I can, I'll just have one follow-up to that. You said, and I recognize it as well, that as trans people, we can recognize and, let's say, each other, and we see each other, and that means as trans people, if we see one of us on screen, we recognize that person, right, and we see ourselves reflected. Yet, in speaking with casting directors, for instance, they'd get back to you like, oh, but we can't tell that this person is trans. So what difference does it make if we're casting a trans person or not for this role? If we can't tell, or it doesn't feel authentic to the time period we're trying to talk about, or stuff like that. So how do you respond to such comments when I'm sure you've heard them?
Don't you love when cis people tell you that the transness on screen doesn't feel authentic? Yes. One of my favorite. Just how cute. This isn't quite the trans that we had imagined. I think that this is and Amos, I'd be so curious for your answer to this question too, but this is one of the great mysteries and paradoxes and glories of being trans, in my opinion, is that what does trans look like? It's a fundamentally unanswerable question. I think that cis casting directors, for the most part, not to overgeneralize, but maybe to overgeneralize, are still understanding gender through a kind of binary logic of masculinity versus femininity. And so, all of our non-binary friends, or those who are strategically pushing at the boundaries of these containers, are rendered illegible by these systems who aren't thinking very creatively. And so I think that, it takes a kind of team approach, but it also takes a kind of recognition that what arrives on screen is a product of what's happening off screen. And so you have to intervene in development, you have to intervene in writing, you have to intervene in producing in order to manifest what you want to happen on screen. It's not just an aesthetic fix, right? Because this is the problem with a kind of liberal fantasy diversity politics, is oh, if we just put people of color on screen, we're gonna understand race and racialization differently. No, it's actually, we're still only understanding whiteness, but now we're using people of color in ways that aren't politically, important or rigorous enough. And the same goes for a kind of queer and trans representational politics, where it's just to Amos's point, we'll just put some queer kids in the back and make our high school feel more representative, right? So I think that it's really trying to think about the problem from all angles, and recognizing that the screen, while it's where we spend a lot of our attention, is only one part of that system.
I think that I hear a lot of my trans masculine and trans male actor friends talk about the struggles of casting calls, of going out for roles that are for trans men or trans boys, and they show up and they're and they instantly know that they're not the way that they're supposed to look, because they've either been on hormones, or they've either, or they're not. There's always something where it's they don't, there's a specification that every role is asking for, and it's a problem, I think, before getting up to that point, of casting, it needs to be addressed. You can't just do an open call that's very specific. If the person creating the project has a very specific visual in mind, it's there's no way to dance around that other than to leave it open, I think, for the talent to come through and then kind of fix the role around who you cast. If it's a trans masculine actor, do an open call for trans masculine actors, and then depending on who this actor is and where they're at in their life and their physical transition, that's how you add that to the role. That's my opinion of things. And I've been on projects where it's been strategic casting for a specific kind of trans role for a specific reason, and then doesn't go as planned for various reasons, because maybe the actor doesn't agree with certain things, so it's a touchy subject. And it's it's definitely hard when there's not trans people making those decisions from the get-go. And yeah, it's just very, very complicated and very stressful to be someone who is like trying to give feedback, proper feedback, and you know, be an ally for the actors behind the scenes, and it not going as planned, you know. So I mean, I think that one thing that I also see is one, like if there is if the person doesn't look trans enough for the role, you know, then it's like, how about for the person saying that, I think that then make that role a cis person that a trans person is playing. You know what I mean? If that's the way that they're coming at it, that's just my point of view.
Thank you. I'll leave the seat to someone else.
I love this seat. This seat's so great.
Okay, wait, someone does want to ask a question, but she's too shy to ask you herself. There you go. It's a friendly session.
I just wanted to ask what you have in mind next following such an amazing documentary in terms of the subject on trans.
I just premiered my next feature. It's a feature film called Framing Agnes. We just ended our run at Sundance, and it takes up these never before seen case files from the UCLA Gender Clinic in the late 1950s, which was this moment in North America where doctors and researchers were literally creating the categories of trans and intersex that we're now in a variety of different ways. And the project stars a cohort of trans identified actors and cultural producers who take on these case files and really sort of turn them inside out. And we hope for a long life with that project. And, you know, Amos and I are hustling some other things to keep our collaboration going.
Yeah, I'm I work in writers' rooms. I'm currently on a show will hopefully be on Amazon soon. And I've written for 2 seasons of the new Gossip Girl, which is on HBO Max. I'm not sure if it's out there or if there is HBO Max where you are, but yeah.
We stream it.
Okay, great. And I'm developing like 3 different series right now that they all have a different variety of transness in it, meaning like different level of, you know, how we talk about transness. Each one is very, very different. And yeah, I hope that they exist in the world so that you can see them. But right now it's like in that development stage where you're just, you know, trying to get it, find a home for it basically to make it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining the seat.
Okay.
Well,
No, because I was more, but we talked about this. Firstly, well done for framing Agnes, and I can't wait. I want to watch it, so maybe we could show it here as well.
Great.
Maybe you can come here next time.
Would love to. Sign me up
It's similar
anytime you want.
Malta, similar to LA.
The lights, it's true. You can come
You can
here.
fit in. No, I was thinking like how amazing it would be, like going back to Billy Jr. It's like knowing that this person has gone through so much shit, like with the, you know, like all those so the television and newspapers, like to approach him, even knowing like, wow, he's gone through hell, still supporting his, like not really knowing much about transness, even though his dad was a trans man, like, and then, you know, like for me, it's like working with trans people or whatever. It's like I feel comfortable because I'm trans myself, so it's like I feel like I'm sensitive enough, and still yet not, because my story is so different to someone else's, you know. And then you approaching this, like going into this document, it's like, of course you know you're gonna do it super well and caring, and but you didn't even tell him beforehand. Like for me, the most touching part, it was 1 hour 3 minutes when you come out to him, and it's like I can feel that you've taken your time. Like there needed to be a time to confine. It's like I would be scared because I meet people who really like me and like we're having conversation. Then there's this thing when you have, do they know what I am, who I am? It's like there's a process, and it's like you want the people you kind of, you feel they're kind to you, and it's like you're loving it. And then what if? So it's like with him, it's happened already. It's like, but he got shit, and then you're there and you're doing so beautifully, and he's not even realizing why it's so not like he doesn't know you're you know, like he's his father is a transvestite, you know.
Mhm.
How was it? How was that?
I was very nervous the whole time. I feel like I kept going up to Chase either like at the end of the day or first thing in the morning before shoots. And I would say, does he know yet? Like, does he know, have you talked? Because Chase was like a point person for Billy Jr. I had never spoken to him before. I had written and done some, you know, worked on the project before the shooting elements, but Chase had really taken the lead as to being the person talking to Billy Jr. and getting ready for the big days of shooting. So I was like, when are you gonna, like, you didn't tell him, he doesn't know, like I was like spinning in my head about it. But then I thought that the way that Chase did it was so wonderful. And I was sitting, I think, next to him. And yeah, I just felt very nervous for myself. And I don't know why, you know, because Billy didn't seem like an angry person or I feel like I didn't feel threatened by him, but you never know. I think it was just old anxieties coming up during that moment.
I think that's the thing, is like you don't know. You know, you really don't. And I think we all carry that in our bodies in different ways. And I was really touched by, speaking of doubling, like really doubling down into our doubling when we brought Jameson into Billy Jr.'s house, because that to me was such an extraordinary opportunity. It's a scene that I now call the like proxy dad scene, you know, where we get to watch Billy Jr. sort of encounter someone of his dad's generation who he can look to and say things out loud to that he didn't have a chance to say. And because we had done some of that emotional work with Billy Jr., he was open to Jameson in a way that was really quite extraordinary. And true to the kind of documentary, we couldn't have planned for and we couldn't have figured out. And it really arrived to us on the day where we thought, well, we're supposed to shoot with Jameson over here, but why don't we bring him over here, because what might happen? And it was really only through Billy Jr.'s willingness and the way in which he started to metabolize the project differently immediately after I outed myself. You could watch him all of a sudden think like, what is the point of this film? Who am I in this film? And I think that that's something really important to consider in documentary more broadly, right? When subjects, participants recognize themselves as serving a function. And so I think for a while, he was like, I'm the person who knows the most about my dad. And then he became a like, whoa, I'm the person who's learning a lot about my dad. Like it's a very palpable shift. And so for Jameson to come in and kind of serve multiple roles in that function felt like a real gift to me as a transmasculine person who was learning alongside them in those moments. Amos, I was just going to keep talking about how I was also just going to say that you're like a buck for so many people that, you know, like there was so many like intergenerational moments in the film, many of which I think arrive on screen, but many of them, you know, I think we just keep to ourselves too as a kind of fabric of the work product that, yeah, that feels very sustaining over time.
Anyone has one last question?
We're very, very actually.
Everyone here wants to
Take a picture with you.
Oh, there's more people.
Oh, wow, everyone was hiding on the sides.
This is the first event at our gallery, so thank
Oh my
you.
God, I
wow.
love this. This is the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're coming to
Thank
Malta
you.
next time.
Yes.
We're coming. So nice.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
have a good morning.
Yes.
Have a good sleep.
And,
Have a good evening.
and
Awesome.
yeah, your film is brilliant, and thank you for chatting to us.
Yep.
Thank you for
Anytime.
having
This
us.
was great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Bye.